tonight we have Rebecca Winthrop here. She's also a senior fellow at Brookings and director of the Center for Universal Education. And education is a topic we all love under the best of circumstances and even under the current situation we find us in. Rebecca's going to give us a look at the global situation, particularly in developing countries, very fragile nation states. You may actually leave here feeling better about our situation, if that's possible. Let me also invite you to contact us at any time with questions about events. Rebecca is going to speak for about 40 minutes and take some questions, so we'll plan on wrapping up about 6:30 or so. Rebecca also gave an interview on KNPR this morning that's linked to on our website if you'd like to hear a little bit more about her research interests. And as always, we'll have these lectures up on our website in a few days. So Rebecca's will join the other 20 or so lectures that we've done if you'd like to catch up on anything that you happen to have missed. Rebecca?
Hi, everybody. Good evening. It's great to be here, and thanks for coming. I'm really pleased to be here because I grew up in Oregon. I'm a West Coaster. I personally love the West Coast. Any chance I can get to get west of the Mississippi, I grab it. Today I'm going to be talking about education in developing countries, very specifically, and just out of pure curiosity for all of your backgrounds and interests, could you raise your hand if you've ever been to Africa? So several of you. So that is something that I didn't get much of a chance to even think about, education in developing countries, when I was growing up and in my schooling in Oregon, and it really wasn't until sort of after college that this broader world opened up to me. And there certainly are a lot of parallels between education in developing countries as well as education problems and challenges and innovative solutions that all of you are working on so hard, both here in Las Vegas and here in the US. One of my sort of main purposes is to give you a context and a background of, what is the developing world? If it's not a place, I think several of you have been there and probably know quite a bit about it, but for those of you who don't, what is the context we're talking about? And then what is the story of education in the developing world? And most importantly, lastly, the third thing I really want to focus on is what should, or rather why should we as Americans care about educational attainment in other countries? Why would it matter to us while we're focusing so much on our own education systems? So first and foremost, just to give a little bit of a background, when we talk about the developing world, there's all sorts of different ways to cut the pie and to think about what includes the developing world. One way to think about it is to look at poverty levels. There are the World Bank has a metric, has a measure of people living on less than $1.25 a day, live in what is defined as extreme poverty. And you can see that the bulk of that, the dark red and the bright red and the oranges are really where the highest number of people living on less than $1.25 a day are located, which you can see is largely is largely Africa and some parts of South Asia, etc. So that's, what one way we measure the idea of the developing world and where the poorest nations are where there's lowest, us and Canada and Europe and Russia and stuff, and Australia are where there's less than 2% of the population live on less than $1.25 a day. So we would probably call that the developed world, or rich nations, poor nations. World Bank term is high-income countries and low-income countries. And in addition to sort of income levels, there's other things that characterize the developing world, such as health indicators, what it's like to live there. One specific indicator that people use a lot is infant mortality. So how many babies die, basically. And this is a chart that shows for every 1,000 babies born, how many die usually before they reach age 1. And in developed countries, like the country where we are, it's about 5 in 1,000, but you can see in the developing world it's huge, 45 per 1,000, which as a new mother is extremely scary to me, just the thought of that. Another sort of data point that gives you a sense of comparison that I don't have a chart for, but is life expectancy. So what's the average, sort of life expectancy? How long are people on average thought to live? And it's very different, as you can imagine, for these poor countries and these rich countries. What do you guys think is the life expectancy in the US? Maybe someone knows it offhand. Just take a guess, if you don't. 78, bingo, 78.4 years. You must have known that. No? yes, clearly. What do you think the life expectancy is in Sierra Leone? It's a country in West Africa. Someone said it, 45. Did someone say 45? Yeah, well, very close, 47.6 years old. So, if I lived in Sierra Leone, on average, I would be nearing the last decade of my life, which is also frightening for me to think about. So again, in addition to poverty rates, there's real differences in health outcomes and life expectancies and ability just to survive. Another sort of summary of some of the major challenges that developing countries face are listed here, and you can I'll give you a moment just to go ahead and read. When we talk about child labor, which is this first one here, 150 million kids involved in child labor, there's very clear definitions of what are child work and child labor. So child labor is not you're babysitting for your little brother and sister. It's really work that kids are involved in that are hazardous to their health, their well-being, could injure or harm them deeply, physically and or mentally. In terms of the next one, 18 million children living with effects of displacement, which is kind of an odd term. These are refugees. Refugees or people who have been displaced within their own country, which are called internally displaced people. They're not actually classified under international law as refugees. In terms of risk of maternal death, that one's pretty clear. So, the worst country in the world, or at least the last time I looked, for maternal mortality, so women dying while giving childbirth. What do you think it is, and what do you think the incidence is? Any guesses?
Continental country.
What's that?
Continental country.
Continental meaning what?
Do you want a continental?
Oh, I don't care. You can throw at anything at this moment. I wouldn't have known this except I read it like last year. Yeah, and it stuck in my mind. Haiti, no. Though it could have surpassed recently. I'm not sure. Sierra Leone, pretty close. Close again. It's Niger. Again, in Africa, 1 in 7 women die in childbirth, which is, again, as a recent mother, that I was like, oh my God, that's just so horrific to put yourself in that position, to think about what your life must be like if those are the odds you're faced with if you're trying to continue your family and community and being a woman in these countries. So anyways, life is tough in many respects, but for plenty of people, for all of you who visited these places or lived in different parts of the world, these are very depressing statistics. They're real statistics, but that's certainly, if you meet people in developing countries, they're not depressed people or depressing people. They're, for the most part, wonderful and warm and have, wonderful extended families. Everyone was always very horrified until very recently that I didn't have any children. They thought it was such a tragic loss, and what was I doing with my life? Sounded like my mother, but you know, it's a very, there's many good qualities. And in fact, a colleague of mine, Carol Graham, this is a bit of an aside, she does work on happiness. She's a colleague at Brookings. And she has done all these happiness surveys around the world and found that actually people in places like Afghanistan are pretty happy. In fact, they're 20 times more likely to smile in a day than people in other Latin American countries. So just because life is very grim in reality, it doesn't mean people themselves are grim. The human spirit is pretty impressive. One thing that could be another feature of the developing world that could be either very depressing or very hopeful, largely depending on what educational opportunities exist, are how young and how youthful the developing world is. So here you see youth demographic map. So this is a map of the median age of the world for the most part. And you'll see that the yellows, the median age is between 14 and 20, which is really young. The light pinks between 20 and 25. So, you know, and the oranges. So you'll see that the, you know, really young, the continent of Africa is a young continent, as well as a lot of places in sort of South Asia and a bit here too. Just to give you one example, half the population in Pakistan is under the age of 17. So, you know, these are very young, youthful countries. A lot of old people up here in Canada, that's a bunch of old people up there, as well as in some parts. And of course, the US is also, our median age is much higher than a lot of the world. So that's really a very sort of brief overview to give people a sense of, you know, what do we mean the context, what do we mean when we talk about developing world? And now the question I want to really turn to is really about education. What's the story about education in the developing world? What are the biggest challenges, biggest needs? There is some good rankings and statistics that we who work on education in the global arena use a lot. One is called the Education Development Index. It's put out by the United Nations, a United Nations organization called UNESCO. And you'll see, not every single country, you won't see the US listed here because they didn't actually fill out the survey and send it back to UNESCO to be ranked, and many other countries are missing too. But you'll see that this is a listing of the highest people in the Education Development Index, and the index is really made up of a couple of variables. Here, total primary NER, which is net enrollment rate, just means how many kids are of school age and enrolled in elementary school. This one, adult literacy rates, how many adults can read and write. This one here is how many girls and boys. Are there equal number of girls and boys enrolled in school or not? There's never been more. These are all almost equal number of girls to boys. It's very rarely the other way around. Survival rates to grade 5, what that means is just, do kids stay in school till grade 5? So you see that all the countries here, largely more or less, are sort of European countries. You've got Korea down here, etc. And they're the ones that are sort of, you know, doing the best globally. Of course, there's many countries missing who are not in the index. But they're the ones who have not only older populations, but are much wealthier. And the low education, these are sort of the bottom tranche of countries on the Education Development Index. And you'll see here that, you know, you've got Nicaragua there, but pretty much everything else is more or less in Africa. And you've got Iraq here, which is not a poor country, you know, by World Bank standards. But of course, they've gone through a lot of conflict and war, so that reduces their educational status. And in fact, conflict is one of the things that particularly impacts the ability of countries to have advanced education systems or to advance their educational attainment of their populations and their children and their youth. There's about 70 million kids out of school in the world today, out of primary school. an equal number out of sort of secondary school, what we would call high school. And of those 70 million kids, half of them live in conflict-affected countries. So it's a really big problem for many reasons. So you'll see here most of the countries affected by conflict are, again, in Africa, in sort of South Asia, around there. Of course, there's Colombia and Haiti there, representing Latin America and our hemisphere. So that is a very difficult problem. Another difficult problem is, let's see, out-of-school youth. A lot more kids are in elementary school, and very, very few kids make it to secondary school. It's just on average, some countries in Africa are getting much more closer to having all their kids enrolled in school. There's still, percentages, totally depends on the country, of kids who don't enroll even in elementary school or what we would call primary school. And then if you average it, it just plummets to like 20-30% of kids actually make it on to secondary school or to high school. And here again, you see that out-of-school youth, the purple and the blue are the biggest, the dark blue, I guess, or light blue, or I'm not sure, turquoisey blue, here are the biggest areas that represent out-of-school youth. And of course, they have younger populations, so that's part of it, but they also sort of coincide with that Sub-Saharan Africa, South and West Asia nexus that we've been looking at. Now, the real question, the policy question that we're particularly interested in at Brookings is, what's the chicken and what's the egg? Do poverty and conflict lead to poor educational attainment? Or does poor educational attainment really have a hand in fostering poverty and conflict? And this has really important policy implications in terms of what our policies, what we can actually do about these things. And of course, I think, the answer is that both sets of relationships exist. And in terms of poverty and conflict holding back educational progress, there's a whole sort of litany of ways in which that happens, and I'll run through a couple. First, there is massive teacher shortages in the developing world. We need about 9 million more teachers, primary school, for all kids to enroll. If we want every single child to get an elementary primary education, we need 9 million more primary school teachers. And believe me, there's not 9 million teachers sitting in teacher training institutes waiting to graduate for those jobs. So even if countries had money to hire them, there are really very few teachers in the pipeline. This is a typical classroom, by the way, probably in Africa or some countries in Asia, where it's cement and the blackboard is built into the wall and just locally. That's sort of they sit on the low part and write on the high part, sort of a desk that's made with a window cracked open in the concrete. There's also really difficult data management systems. I'm not sure where this picture came from, actually. My research assistant dug this up. I don't know really what it's of, but I like the concept of, hopefully in education ministries in developing countries, there would be a desk with a old computer probably and some sort of files keeping track of students and what grades are full or not, or where schools need to be built and who's graduating, etc. But management of education systems is really hard in these countries. A lot of times ministries of education don't even have computers. They don't, how they keep track of things is, oftentimes they don't, but it's really difficult. I worked a lot in Afghanistan several years ago, and I visited right after the fall of the Taliban. I visited the country and was working on setting up education programs, and I went to the Ministry of Education, which runs education for the whole country, and the building was totally bombed out. The minister had his window bombed out, and he was sitting freezing in his coat and his hat, and we had a nice talk, and he went searching for a piece of paper and a pencil. I mean, they really had nothing. And I came back a year later, or a year and a half later, and they'd progressed tremendously. They'd gotten some windows in, and a little space heater, and they'd gotten some pads, pens, and paper. And then I was asking, well, how are you doing? What's your educational status? How many kids are in school? How many kids are not? How many schools do you need to be built? He was really pleased. He said, we've started a fantastic data management system. We're really getting a handle on this. And he pulled out this big, huge, sort of literally the paper was like that big. I don't know where they got this huge paper. Stack of papers that had little numbers written on it all the way down. He had developed a system of tracking all the students in the entire country by hand. He'd asked each teacher to fill in by hand, and they gave them to the principal, and the principal would add them up and send it to the district person, and the district would add it up and send it to the central person. And that's how they tried to figure out where did they need to build the schools, how did they, how many girls, how many boys, did they need more female teachers, where were they get them from? But you can imagine the massive amounts of time that took, and that was just to get some basic, probably semi-inaccurate data. So it's a really very difficult problem. Another thing, of course, is limited lack of textbooks. Here's a typical sort of classroom. Students don't have textbooks to take home with them to study in after school, but they do have a few textbooks to use in the school. In one country, one region of Kenya that I visited in the north, there's one textbook for every 20 students. So, I mean, how you're able to learn is like that is, as you can imagine, is very difficult. High pupil-teacher ratios, of course, directly related to our teacher shortage problem. Again, another typical example, classes are really packed. In Africa, 50 students to one teacher is pretty standard. I've been in many classrooms that have 100 kids to one teacher, which, I mean, if you've ever been in a classroom, it's really very difficult to teach. But kids are motivated. Those boys at the back, they will stand there the entire day probably and do the best they can to, you see this kid is writing as best he can, trying to take notes in the margins there. There's very few, often schools don't have water for students to drink or bathrooms to use, which can be, as you can imagine, hard, and especially for girls, especially adolescent girls, when they start menstruation, they often just can't go to school that week, which leads them to get farther and farther behind and often drop out. Again, another very typical school. There's no school structure, but this is a village. They want to have some learning going on. They sit under a tree. It's hard when the wind blows, the papers fly away, but they persist and make do. Long distances to school. In West Africa, it's pretty common. 70% of the population, of the students, I would say, the kids walk more than 3 kilometers to get to school. How much is that in miles? Is that like 2 miles? 3? 1.8. Yeah. Okay. So far, for those of you who don't operate in kilometers. Again, lots of very, another typical school. That's a cute kid. Here's a refugee camp. This is a typical refugee camp. Some are there longer and end up having more stable structures, but these are where people are living. These are all little houses. This is what the UN passes out, this plastic sheeting, when people come fleeing across a border. And again, there are schools in there. I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of these might be a school, actually. So you can imagine, difficult context in which to try to continue learning. But on the other hand, on the other side of relationship, and this is the story that's told much less frequently, and to me this is the story that has really powerful policy implications for all of us, which is, education does have a very important role to play in combating poverty and reducing the risk of conflict. And this is one of the reasons that we need to think about education in developing countries very seriously in our country. It's actually directly relevant to us here in the U.S., despite all of our worries and well-founded, our own well-founded problems and concerns with our own education systems. So, first, education, especially quality education, is one of the most important drivers of economic growth in these poor countries, in these developing countries around the world. There's really good evidence to show that there's a very strong causal relationship between countries that have good scores on math and science are as one proxy indicator, we would call it, are countries that prosper economically, and that helps drive growth. This is certainly one of the factors that helps spur growth among the Asian tigers, the countries in Asia that have, prospered over the last several decades. Also, that growth and reduction of poverty and in poor countries and developing countries is also a really important source of our U.S. growth economically. The biggest trading partners that the U.S. has are in emerging markets, and most of the emerging markets are really in these poor countries that we've talked about, these developing nations. And the more those countries get an educated population and can lift themselves out of poverty, that becomes a much greater expanded market for U.S. goods and services, and is an important way for us to get ourselves out of economic distress as well. Another reason that we should care is that there is now emerging data that's pretty good, that education has an important role to play. It's certainly not the only factor. There's many factors, especially, political issues, but education has an important role to play in increasing security and maintaining peace and decreasing the incidence of conflict. Particularly if it's a quality education, if it's a relevant education. There are some studies that say that an increase in 1 year of the average schooling of a population is estimated to reduce the risk of civil war by 3.6%. And there's been a range of other studies that have come up with some of these similar types of findings. There's also seems to be an emerging consensus around getting boys into high school. The more boys who are in high school in these countries, conflicts tend to last much shorter. The duration of conflict reduces, and it's important to note that it's not just the amount of time people spend in school, but it's the quality of that education. Education in many countries is very linked to national ideology, to who we are as citizens, how we view others in the world. And there certainly are contexts of education that has a curriculum and or teaching and pedagogy that really foments intolerance and not accepting others and can exacerbate friction. So it's important to note that you need to have a quality education as well as a relevant education. Youth unemployment is a big factor in instability. We're seeing some of that in Egypt right now, and so you need to have an education that gives young people the skills they need to translate that into jobs. So it is an important, again, concern when we think about conflict risk and reducing conflict risk, which of course is something we're very concerned with here in the US in terms of our national security debate. It also can produce very big and important effects on health in developing countries. If you talk to anybody who works on sort of global health or health in developing countries, they'll say, we know that the best thing to do that has the biggest impact to improve health outcomes is girls' education. Of course, you also need to improve clinics and medicines and vaccines and all sorts of things, but that in terms of numbers-wise, girls' education, especially if they can get the kind of skills and knowledge and critical thinking and problem solving that comes with higher education, or when I say higher in this context, I mean high school, not university. So if you can get girls through elementary school into high school, you have really big impacts. They have much less incidences of maternal mortality, so they don't die in childbirth as much. This is often because they're much more empowered to say, hey, I'm not feeling well, get me to the clinic, you take me, etc. They have much healthier kids, so infant mortality reduces. And in fact, when their livelihoods, their skills, they invest back in the community. So there's it's a pretty good consensus in the literature that community development and local community empowerment is definitely spurred forward by investing in girls' secondary education. So if those reasons aren't enough for you, of course there's the moral argument that, I think everyone should subscribe to, not everyone does, but the fact that, it's also the right thing to do. We should care about the educational status of kids in the developing world. It's a basic fundamental human right. It's not fair, nor is it right or just, that just because these kids are born where they're born, and it means that they're allotted such a difficult path and limited opportunities. So given that what I would say education has a pretty central role to improving our global community and is of deep interest not only to poor countries themselves, but to us in the developed world, what has the global community done about education around the world? Can anybody think of a few things? Any ideas? What do you think the global community's done? Could be anything. Thrown money at it? Yes, but not enough. Build schools, yep. Send teachers, yep. So these are all, you guys are naming all sorts of things that definitely happen and that fall under, which is frankly a recent last sort of, couple decades perspective that education should be important. And of course, you probably all know about the human rights to education. There's many instruments of international human rights. These are two that talk specifically about the fact that everyone has a right to an education. This one, Education for All, it's a global movement of education ministers all around the world. And 20 years ago, they gathered in Thailand, and they all agreed, and it was people from developed countries, rich countries, as well as poor countries saying, you know what, the status of education is really terrible, but we know it's in everyone's best collected interest if we improve it. And so there was this compact, this global compact between rich countries and poor countries, developed and developing countries. And the poor countries said, we promised to come up with really strong plans to how to advance education in our country. And the rich countries said, okay, we'll promise to fund you, give you the whatever missing money. So you come up with whatever funds and whatever you need to implement those plans. Whatever's missing will not go unfunded, which of course totally didn't happen, but it happened a little bit, and it's been happening. And so that's one important aspect of what the global global community did. And they laid out 8 really specific goals and I can tell you what they are later, if you're interested on what we should focus on in terms of improving education. And 2 of those goals were picked up in the Millennium Development Goals. And this has been, in 2000, the UN system and really the global community altogether said, you know what, we want to really harness all our efforts and focus on a couple things over the next sort of 15 years. They set themselves the deadline of 2015 to really achieve some progress in some really fundamental important areas. And 2 of the 6 goals are on education. One is that all kids should enroll in primary school. Enroll in complete primary school, and that the second goal is that girls and boys should do that in equal numbers. Pretty, basic, you would think. And actually, this has been a pretty good news story in international development. There was at the time, millions and millions more kids out of school. So there were 110 million kids, and today there's about 70 million kids out of school. In 5 years, it's projected that there's still going to be 50 million kids out of school, so we're not going to meet the target globally, but it's actually one of the education goals is one of the Millennium Development Goals that has made the most progress. So it does show actually that if you concentrate and invest and focus, you can make progress in international development. But what we're facing now, which is not something that we in the global education community really knew at the time, and it's emerged, is that the assumption that if you get kids into school, they will learn something. It probably sounds familiar to some of the debates we're having here in the States. And what we've learned now is there really is a global learning crisis, and we need to think very strongly about shifting the paradigm in the global community to focus on this. And the global learning crisis, I define, this is a Brookings definition, has sort of 3 dimensions. First, of course, there's all the kids who are still out of school who have no access to learning opportunities. And mainly those kids are girls who live in rural areas, who are part of an ethno-linguistic minority or live in conflict. The second part of the learning crisis is that kids, especially in the early grades, are not learning the fundamental foundational skills they need. And the third part is that a lot of kids who do go on and are able to, master basic foundational skills are not learning relevant skills to the job market. And here's just one chart while we finish up. This just shows you, this is a chart showing percentage of students who could not read a single word as they enter 3rd grade. So you'll see several countries listed twice in different languages, so it's not just a mother tongue issue. But from 90% to 50% of kids can't recognize a single word. So basically kids are really not learning to read in these contexts, which is a foundational skill for further development. So it really is a serious crisis. Luckily, there are lots of things upon which we can build a paradigm shift. First of all, students in these countries are some of the most motivated kids to learn I have ever seen anywhere. They are completely committed, sitting for hours at a time. Even if the teacher doesn't show up, they practiced amongst themselves. Leaders who are starting to realize that learning is a really important issue. And parents, especially in these countries, invest huge sums. In Haiti, they invest on average, half their annual income in educating their kids, which is massive, and Haiti isn't alone. So there's huge motivation on the parts of parents and communities. And I would say that slowly, people in rich countries, donors who help fund, part of this global compact, are beginning to learn that and realize that there is a learning crisis and they need to adapt their strategies. So the learning crisis is certainly something we're working on at Brookings. And I think I'll stop there because I think we want to make sure that we have a good 20 minutes for questions. So I'll open it up. Yeah.
Where do you get the teachers from? I mean, some of the villages I've been in, they have local teachers, but they're ignorant as the students. Maybe they teach them black magic, So how do you establish the teacher at a certain level? Where do you get that?
Yeah, well, to be honest, the data I've seen shows that actually local teachers, even though they're not trained, because you're right, there's teachers who are profoundly unprepared to be teachers, but a lot of the teachers who are from local communities, because oftentimes teachers will, if they're trained, they have to go to a in-service teacher training college, so they don't get trained while they're teaching in schools. They have to leave the teaching profession and go to like a 2 or a 4-year teacher training college in the capital, and then they become certified, and then the government sends them around the country, and they probably don't live in the village or community where they grew up. So those teachers are perhaps better, but also they have less accountability to the community. So they're absent more often. They're also, more highly trained, so can do, second and third jobs to make money because teacher salaries are really low. So I think actually what you said is actually part of the solution, is if we can train in service local teachers, that would be a huge benefit for getting some of these teachers, because there are not 9 million teachers sitting in teacher training colleges ready to graduate who are well prepared. And there's some interesting programs. The Open University is an organization that's done a program on distance education with teachers, because we know that the number of teacher training colleges just don't provide, we just don't have the pipeline or capacity to train the teachers we need. So they're doing sort of interesting things with mobile phones and various other things to train teachers and bring them up to speed. Like you said, a lot of teachers need basic content refreshing, right? Basic math, basic literacy, numeracy, stuff that they can teach correctly. Yeah.
What's your assessment of the effectiveness of non-governmental organizations, churches, service clubs, and others, who seem to be doing some of the same kind of work in these areas? Are they more effective or less effective than governmental entities? And are they less or more affected by corruption, which may be where some of the educational money ends up before it ever gets down to the village?
The classroom, right?
Classroom.
Yeah.
So
So I used to work in NGOs, so I have a lot of firsthand experience in that. And I would classify NGOs in sort of three, well, maybe two categories. There's a bunch of what I would call professional non-governmental organizations, where the people who are working in there and the strategies they're working on are very sophisticated. It's their careers, they've gone to school for it, they're professionals. And though, like Save the Children and CARE and, various other NGOs that I'm sure we would have all heard of. And they're essential, especially in conflict countries where there's practically no government often. They're the first on the ground. They're essential to sort of ensuring services are done. And they can be quite good. The only problem there is, as much as they try, their incentive structure is not to necessarily build up the local NGOs, because they get, these NGOs survive on big grants, right? They get grants from government actors or foundations to do work, and so there is a habit of not working themselves out of a job as best they could. Then there's a whole set of what I think are really fantastic, but mixed effectiveness, what I would call NGOs, which are communities who are involved in church networks or faith-based groups or local initiatives that aren't necessarily professionals. So they, all the people investing and contributing probably have other jobs and are doing this on the side, and maybe take service trips to go back and forth. And I've seen some fantastic work in those contexts. I've also seen some really bad work in those contexts, not because people meant it to be bad, but because they just didn't have the training, especially in places like conflict or fragile states. I had to rescue a church group once. I was in Eastern Sudan, and they were driving along in a landmine area with you're supposed to have, anyways, it was terrible. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't have a map. They had they just had volunteered, and they'd sent people to deliver medicines, and they, all their medicines there had expired because they couldn't keep them cold enough. So you find that, which is scary, both for the people who volunteer, but also for the fact that those medicines could get into villagers' hands and be used. But there's also a ton of great work going on.
do you want to address the corruption issue?
The corruption issue. Well, are NGOs less corrupt? Probably. I think probably. I mean, corruption. I get that question a lot, and frankly, what's worse than corruption, because corruption is people really trying to take stuff and that doesn't belong to them, et cetera. And that happens a lot. But I wouldn't say it happens, any more in higher volumes or larger incidents than it happens here in the U.S. We've had Abramoff and all these things, so it happens everywhere in the world. But the larger problem, frankly, is lack of good governance structures. It's sort of governments just not having the capacity, whether it's because they have data based on sheets, they just can't quite get their act together to figure out how to get the textbooks from here to the village over there. They don't know how to do it. They don't have the trucks. The managers don't have the skills, that type of a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes me wonder kind of about the global commitment to education. It doesn't seem like necessarily there's the kind of commitment that people would like to see, so NGOs and other, come in and try and rectify the situation, to the degree that they're able to. But overall, it seems like it's going to be very difficult to get people to, move into global education. Places like Afghanistan don't want to educate women, for example,
Right.
or, any number of conflicts. I mean, I lived in Thailand for a number of years, taught in the schools there, and traditionally the temple would offer an awful lot of the education primary grades, and so when Western forms of education came in, a lot of that got disrupted, and I don't think it necessarily got to a better state than it had been previously. So there's a lot of different elements to this.
Yeah, no, it is. It's complicated. And you bring up the question of sort of cultural relevance, and a lot of times international development aid has been criticized as sort of neo-colonialism, and I think that is true in some instances, and I don't think it's by intent. Having walked the halls of the World Bank and various other institutions who get accused of this, I don't think the people in it who are designing these programs mean to do that. But there is a big power differential. So the World Bank shows up to a country and says, hi, we of course want to support your plans. Tell us what your plans are. And they say the plan, they think, oh, that's total crap. You can't do that. Are you kidding me? And by the way, we have, $500 million if you want to do it our way. So, it's not by intent, but, there's a little bit of arrogance, perhaps. And so, the World Bank now, I'm picking on the World Bank, they actually do a lot of good work, is much better at sort of listening to communities, figuring out what's relevant, important, what's working, don't mess up what's working, supplement, et cetera. But there still is a lot of that. Was there anybody over here that I missed? Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm really curious about this concept that education reduces conflict. We consider that the United States is a fairly educated country, but we've caused probably 100 conflicts, serious conflicts in the last 100 years, in 100 different countries, I should say.
Yeah.
And how do you reconcile
How do we square that?
Is there anything about the content of the education?
Well,
what's going on?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I should have specified, all the research that this is emerging from is talking about reducing civil war. It's not talking about people invading others or, causing war outside of their borders. So, most of the conflicts in the world today are civil wars, are internal. They're not necessarily interstate between countries like, World War I, World War II, et cetera. So that's the difference. So the data, your theory could potentially be right, that education doesn't reduce sort of conflict making, but the data really looks at civil wars. And it's because, if you have a really sort of elite education system that marginalizes whole populations, that just further inflames how aggravated and pissed people get, and can exacerbate the tensions. Did you have a follow-up? Yeah.
But even the civil wars, in many cases, are caused by these educated countries operating. Tunisia, for example.
How is Tunisia caused by?
Well, the basic issue there is the government is receiving support from the United States.
Right.
It's created by the United States.
Same with Egypt, right?
What?
Same with Egypt.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And if you go through every country, you'll see behind the scenes today, in the last 50 years, the United States government.
Yeah, well, that is really a very separate question, separate body of research. It's definitely true that the political dynamics in a country have a huge role to play. I mean, the fact that the U.S. has supported Egypt's leader for many, many years, invested in its military, et cetera, has a very important role to play in a lot of things. But the data on education and civil war, it really looks at, I'll give you the example of Kosovo. Before Kosovo was a separate country, while it was under Serbia, they had an education system which outlawed the use of the Albanian language, which was Kosovar, Albanians, they spoke Albanian. You couldn't learn any Albanian history. In fact, you could, and then they had a whole list of things. You couldn't attend at certain periods of time. So basically what happened is the Kosovar Albanians were oppressed, and education was really used as a tool to enforce that oppression. And there ended up being, a whole sort of parallel underground education system before the war broke out. And so education itself, there's nothing inherently right or wrong, inflammatory. It's how it's used and how it's manipulated. They can either inflame, or, you have opposite examples of countries that have, really dicey relationships, that have education systems that have multiple languages, teach multiple histories, try to reach out to marginalized areas, and it can really reduce tensions, mitigate. So that's what the research is. There was someone over here, yes.
To use the analogy, it seems like the boat is sinking really fast because we have a huge number of people under the age of 20 coming into childbearing age that are going to have children. So the problem isn't what you define. The problem is 5 times, 6 times, 7 times that large in
Absolutely.
the next 10 years.
How many kids are going to be born? You're going to have 1 billion babies coming into this world.
Exactly. So what, the Brookings Institute, you're highly regarded, is the solution that we're just going to have some NGOs, or we're going to spend a few dollars and try to give these kids a teacher?
Right.
Isn't the problem? Doesn't it require radical attempts to, as opposed to sort of we'll get
playing around the edges.
One teacher in front of another 50 students, and that would be the solution. Because we don't have. If it's 10 million we need today, it's 20 million teachers we need within the next 5-10 years.
Yeah.
So what? Anyway, what?
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think you're spot on in terms of assessing what is the scope of the problem. And there's a couple of sort of ways to look at potential solutions, and they kind of have to go hand in hand. One is to really try to ramp up global giving. And I'm not talking about how much an NGO or church groups, because those are really important, but they're very small in size. But I'm talking about, we only need $16 billion to get every last kid in elementary school today. We'll need more, and that's a lot of money, but the amount of money that floats, that's probably a couple days profit for Goldman Sachs or something, I'm not sure. But there's how do you get some of the money floating around the world today into that solution from externally, from the global economy. So one thing would be to really pressure developed countries' governments to prioritize education, which frankly it hasn't been prioritized in the last couple of years. It used to be prioritized a couple of years ago, and now there's been new administrations changing, and it isn't really a big priority of anybody except for the British, I think. Then there's a lot of people working on trying to figure out, sort of a global transaction tax on financial services or whatever.
So money's one of the answers.
Yeah, money is one. Another, external money. But basically external money is not going to solve everything. Most of the money and support comes from the countries themselves. So another is really trying to figure out how do you support the capacity of those governments to do their job better and to reach these kids. And then a third is sort of technical strategies. There's a lot of people working on thinking about, we shouldn't focus just on schooling. Let's just focus on, let's get every kid reading by, this is a new thing for USAID. Let's get every kid reading by, 2020. And it could be through a school, it could not be through a school, it could be through a mobile phone. There's great sort of mobile phone pilots in Pakistan that have showed kids can really learn to basic literacy. So totally non-school based lateral education strategies that can reach massively more people. So I I definitely agree with you.
As you talked about it, and so you showed us statistics coming down, 30%, frankly, in 8 years is not a bad statistic. How much, though, do you start bumping into the caste system or the religious issues? I mean, to get the 100% you're talking about, where is that, or are you already factoring that in as those are out as far as 100% goes?
No, they're definitely not out. And the way the global education community talks about it is sort of the last 20%. So the kids who are not in school, let's just take primary school, elementary school, it's often less, religion might play a role in it, but it's less about that. It's actually, if you look at all the data, the kids who are by and large out of school around the world are girls, not just girls. There's plenty of wealthy and middle income in comparative terms, in those countries, girls who are doing fine, but girls who are poor, who live in rural areas, who are part of an ethno-linguistic minority.
So are there no percentages that are left out because of religious or, I'm just trying to think.
Oh, no, I'm sure there are, but that actually isn't the biggest. It's really gender, class, and location. Rural, urban is the huge divide in education. There's a ton of other subgroups there. There's child laborers who don't get any access to education. There's kids who get married early, or there are many sort of cultural practices, but those aren't the biggies. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just, again, the caste system, there's certain countries that are, or certain areas
Yes.
of the world where they're going to say that's life.
Oh, so how do you convince them, you're saying? No, yeah, well, identifying who is out of school and then getting them into school is a whole other ballgame. I mean, there's a whole range of cultural barriers that people run up against, for sure. You mentioned the caste system, which is one, but there's many, many others. But to be honest, I worked in Afghanistan for quite some time, and even people who were members of the Taliban wanted their girls to go to school that I met. They wanted them to learn to read and write because they wanted them to learn the Quran. So I think, we think here of religion as a massive barrier, but I've met many people, who want what's good for their children, their girls, their, daughters, etc. Whether they're able to is a different question. We have, Bill, are you? Yeah.
One more question, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, given all of that you just talked about in relation to, the issues that come up and all, what do you think the chances are in terms of maybe just a percentage of actually reaching people that you'd like to reach in terms of having people become educated and so forth in all these places around the world and so forth? Obviously 100% is probably a little over
Right.
optimistic, but what?
I'm a little depressed at this year about it, frankly, because we did great for the last many years, last decade, and now the pace of growth, the pace of change has slowed, and we're kind of leveling off to the point where actually at 2015, which was the big goal for the Millennium Development Goals, we're going to have more. If we continue at this pace, we're going to have more kids out of school in 5 years than today, with population growth and all that stuff. So frankly, I'm a bit depressed. We need, as this gentleman said, some radical solutions is what we need.
Thank you. Let me thank you. These were just great questions. I'm
Absolutely.
really impressed with you guys. Thanks for coming. We're going to wrap up because we're at the hour, but Rebecca will be here for a few minutes to answer some questions we didn't get to. Thanks for coming. I hope we'll see you next week.
All right. Thanks.